In this second talk, we've talked about basic background, critical concepts, et cetera, et cetera. And now this talk, when we were planning the symposium, this was really nice because we were able to sort of do the first part, which I thought was really important, and then kind of get to the more, what do you do like in clinical practice part, which is going to be this part. So today we'll talk about assessment, we'll talk about intervention, and I hope many of you hopefully will find this helpful. Same disclosures as before. Not really going to spend time on this since we already looked at it before. I work at UT Dallas, et cetera, et cetera. Same acknowledgements as before. Very thankful to everyone in my lab, collaborators, kids and families and teachers who I've worked with, and areas, institutions and foundations and folks who have provided financial support for my research. Okay, in the second talk, we're going to talk first generally about some aspects that are important to factor in when you're going to be providing clinical services to dual language learners. I'll talk about some best practices from the evidence base for conducting bilingual assessment. We'll talk about some tests that are available. And then we're going to look at, is that enough, or do you have to kind of go beyond the norm, right? I'll spend some time on bilingual language sample analysis, and then I'll finish with some aspects of intervention. So before we do all of that, and to kind of get us ready for this kind of time together, thinking more clinically, I want you to look at this video, which I'm about to play. And I want you to pay really close attention at this child and what aspects you notice. And I'm going to make sure to, before I play the video, to open my chat. I know people were trying to change their names on their screen or whatever. So anyway, go ahead and see what aspects you notice. I'll have the chat window open to see what people say. And as you hear this child and see this child, I want you to think about what is happening in this interaction, right? And I want you to also think about this child's phonological production, her essentially speaking rate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so go ahead and listen to this child, put on your clinician hat, right? And we'll have a brief conversation about this.
¿Cómo se dice manzana en inglés?
¿Cómo se dice manzana? ¿Y plátano?
Manzana.
Ok. ¿Y cómo se dice aguacate?
Aguacate.
Muy bien. ¿Cómo se dice cabeza? ¿Y cómo se dice nariz?
Nariz.
Nose. ¿Cómo se dice ojos?
¿Cómo se dice ojos en inglés? Eyes.
¿Y boca?
¿Boca? ¿Cómo se presenta? Mouth.
Mouth. ¿Cómo se dice manos?
Hand.
¿Cómo se dice piernas?
Esa parece como la mía.
Sí. ¿Cómo se dice piernas?
¿Cómo se dice piernas en inglés?
Legs. ¿Cómo se dice?
Okay, so let's see. Kathy M is saying vocabulary not connected, language being observed. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, vocabulary not connected, language being observed. Yes. Any other observations? Think about what was the nature of this interaction, right? Some people see this video and they're like, oh, she's awesome, and she like knows a lot of English. But what's the nature of this interaction we just saw? Is it a conversation? Is it right? And so, I don't know this little girl or his or her parents, but yes, it's basically something that they've been practicing and they wanted to put it on video, right? So this is something that clearly been doing with her. She knows the task, right? Yeah, she's really happy. I'm assuming these are probably her parents. But this is something that they've been practicing and they wanted to put it on video, right? This is not a conversation. This is not like you're observing a child playing with her parents or other kids, right? And yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of phonological production, I don't know what you all noticed, but I noticed certain things in terms of especially vowel production, right? This is a kid who speaks Spanish, who's learning some words in English. And I think that was very clear in phonological production, especially the vowel production tended to be kind of heavily influenced by Spanish. And there were little things going on that you could sort of see from the child's face, right? There was some initial phoneme cueing that somebody was doing with her for some of these words, right? So super cute, super fun to look at. But this is a child who, if you kind of had to make an assumption, this is probably a child whose English language development is still pretty limited, right? There's this task. She's good at naming certain things when she's prompted, but she probably cannot really sort of have connected language output in English just yet, right? But receptively, probably she's more advanced than expressively, which is the case for all of us. So, okay, I just wanted to kind of show you, I think it's helpful to kind of see a kid and be like, okay, let me start thinking clinically about dual language learners. Okay. Oops. Okay, so let's talk about service delivery and we'll talk about some general issues, right? So when we refer to quote unquote linguistic minority populations, we tend to sort of be talking about dual language learners, right? And providing services that are appropriate to dual language learners, it's challenging and complex, yes, but it's also, I believe, very fulfilling. And when I did this as a clinician, I absolutely loved it, right? This is the population I love to work with. And we also know that there's this existing history that DLL kids, they just have a higher tendency to be clinically misdiagnosed. It doesn't mean that they're misdiagnosed all the time, but there's just a higher likelihood, right? And we've seen this over and over in the literature, and some of those who are in clinical practice have sometimes also seen this, right? Some of us have gotten kids on our caseload that we didn't test, but we start working with them and we're like, why is this kid in therapy, right? And sometimes the opposite too. Sometimes there are kids, sometimes we'll test the kid, let's say who's like in third grade, and very clearly there's language impairment. And sometimes you wonder, has this child not been in therapy for the last 5 years, right? So both things happen, right? But underdiagnosis and overdiagnosis, I think occurs. There's a high likelihood that it occurs with these kids. And then from a recent study where SLPs were essentially sampled from across the country in terms of their skill set in working with bilingual children, on average, across the country, SLPs who do not have specialized training in working with bilingual populations, they report that their ability to diagnose bilingual kids with speech sound production or language disorders, they feel that they can't do that very, very reliably, right? And that's obviously a concern, but people can do it. They just need the right training, right? And I know there was a question about this in our previous talks. So we will talk about this today a little bit later on. Okay, so before we get into some nitty gritty about clinical practice, we just talked about a lot of these things, but I'm just gonna go ahead and summarize them again. This is just in a nutshell, what do we know about dual language learners? So I'm just gonna try to summarize it. First, acquiring one language. Acquiring one language is a complex task, but acquiring two languages is arguably a little bit more complex, right? Is it quick and easy? I would say for most kids, probably not as quick or easy as it could be. Again, it can be quick and easy, but you have to have these certain conditions, right? You have to have these equal opportunities and support to use both languages, which is not necessarily the case all the time in different parts of our country, right? We know that dual language acquisition It's similar in terms of, these milestones that kids, like let's say in English, right? What morphemes are they acquiring when? The order is similar, or in Spanish too, different types of morphosyntactical skills, but the rate tends to be different relative to monolinguals, right? So let's think about monolingual English speakers, and we think about Brown's morphemes, right? And we think, oh, pretty much by like age 4 to 5, they really have mastered all of Brown's morphemes, and they're kind of at a level 4, level 5. For typically developing kids who are monolingual English speaking, that's totally true. But if you have a child who starts to systematically acquire English, let's say at the age of 3 or 4, when the kid starts going to preschool, for example, they are going to acquire those morphemes, right? And kind of these kind of Brown's morphemes in English in the same order, but the rate of acquisition is clearly going to be different because they're learning these morphemes systematically, starting from, let's say, age 3 or 4, not from birth, right? So there's this difference in rate of acquisition, right? We know that, if you have worked with one kid who's a dual language learner, and then you work with another kid who's a dual language learner, they're probably going to be really quite different. And just think about this bilingual continuum. You're going to find kids who have different bilingual profiles, and that's quite common. And we know that kids who have language disorders can acquire 2 languages, and the fact that they have a language disorder or impairment doesn't negatively impact their ability to acquire 2 languages. And sort of saying by default, we're only going to focus on one language because this child has language disorder, we know is not beneficial for these kids, because what you're doing most of the time when that decision is made, people will say, let's just teach them let's do therapy in English because that's the language that they're going to need to learn anyway for school. The kind of fallacy in that theory is that you are essentially not leveraging the skills that this kid actually has in the other language. You're basically just suppressing all of that, and trying to start like kind of basically but the kid's not a clean slate, right? The kid definitely has skills in the other language. So we've seen from the evidence base as well that kids have language impairments. When you compare them to monolingual kids with language impairments, their language skills are essentially very comparable, right? They're not lower, they're pretty comparable. So the differences are not clinically significant, right? The kids with language impairments have language impairments, whether they're learning one language or they're learning more than one language, right? It's something about the language learning skills and processes involved that is impaired, right? So not just comparable language skills, but the types of errors, for example, that they'll make are going to be similar. Sometimes they're a little higher, but they're not clinically, the differences are not clinically significant. The types of errors and how often they'll make those errors is going to obviously differ from kid to kid. And from some of the literature, we've seen that some of the error types that they might make, for example, like in their English, they're likely heavily influenced to some degree by the pairing, right? So is it Spanish English, or is it Arabic English, or is it Tagalog and English? Like what's the combination, right? Because we know that there's typological differences between languages, and then there's, with any 2 languages, you're going to have some shared features, and you're going to have features that are unique to each language, what we would call unshared features. And that can be in phonology, that can be in morphosyntax. Okay, so that's kind of trying to summarize really quickly, kind of, if we had to summarize, what do we know about these kids? I mean, I try to kind of bring up kind of the big issues, right? Now let's shift into clinical mode, right? Let's talk about best practices for bilingual assessment. So you get a referral for a dual language learner for speech language evaluation, or maybe it's for maybe it's not evaluation for speech and language, but it could be evaluation for hearing, right? So you're going to have multiple questions, right? Like, what do you do, right? One obvious question is, what tools am I going to use to be able to test this kid, right? And notice here I have the little parentheses like in for the plural, because they use one test or they use more than one test. We'll talk about some of those issues today. Not just what test do I use, but what languages or what language do I test this child in? And what if I don't know the kid's native language or the kid's other language, right? Like, what do I do, right? So sometimes we'll kind of face these moments of that we're like, oh, I don't know what to do. Like, but there is a way forward, right? There's best practices in terms of how to handle these issues, right? And we'll talk about those over the course of this talk. So an important thing is just kind of take a step back and think, okay, what's the purpose of doing a speech and language evaluation with dual language learners? A really important piece here is you, as reliably as you can, you want to either confirm or rule out that there's a language impairment, language disorder, or a speech sound production disorder. And you need to differentiate between making that diagnosis and whether it's quote unquote a language difference, or let's call it like a second language acquisition difference, right? You want to make sure you can do that pretty well, and that you have some, ideally a high degree of confidence that you're doing that. With this next part, I think is not just about DLLs, but I would say just in general clinical practice, which is whenever we do assessment, I think it's pretty easy to figure out where the kid has breakdowns, right? I think it's equally as important, and now that I'm putting on my clinician hat and from my own clinical experience, I think it's really important to also be able to systematically determine what can the kid actually do, right? Not just where the weaknesses are, but where are the strengths in both of their languages, right? And then we'll try to answer this question today, which is, does that mean that you have to confirm that a kid has the skill in both languages all the time, right? So a lot of times when we talk about bilingual assessment, we'll think, well, we always have to test this kid in both languages. And we'll talk about that because in clinical practice, I feel this is something that we almost need to think more critically about, because of what is the purpose of language assessment, right? And the purpose of a language assessment, and we'll talk about it later today, is to determine, is there an impairment or not, right? Not necessarily what is the kid's proficiency in both languages. Okay, so again, this is generally speaking, right? I think before you kind of plan out your assessment protocol, I think you always just have to sort of think about these questions. I think they're really important, right? Which is, okay, I'm going to be assessing this child or this group of kids that I have a list for. You want to think about, hey, like, especially if these families are different from you and from your background, you want to think about what are the unique needs of these families, right? You want to think, yes, what languages does my client speak? A lot of this obviously can come from a very detailed case history, which hopefully everybody does. But also, what potential dialectical variations is this child potentially going to be demonstrating when I test this kid, right? Another important question is, what are their background experiences? And by that, we'll talk about it a little more, but it's really more about what are their experiences with being in this interaction of formal assessment, right? Think of that little video with that little girl, where they clearly had practiced that quite a bit. Sometimes we will test kids in their initial evaluation, and it might be a kid who, one, has never been evaluated before formally, and who maybe at home has never done these type of very structured, sort of almost like interrogative interactions, maybe like with their parents, right? So it might be a totally foreign interaction for the kid, right? So we need to keep that in mind if when we test kids who have never been tested before. And then finally, what kinds of things can you do as a clinician before you test this kid, right? When you think about your materials, when you think about your tools, how can you make your assessment least biased, right? Arguably, it's impossible to make it non-biased. I mean, that's an ideal goal, but I think what we really want to do is make it the least biased possible, right? And that has to do definitely with the tools that you're using, the images that you're showing, and the kid or the kids who you're testing, right, and their background. Okay, so past experience. So, whether we're talking about skills in the classroom or we're talking about clinical assessment, a lot of times their experiences at home, some of these kind of cultural norms, kind of really inform what are the experiences the kid has coming into you interacting with this kid in the clinical assessment, right? Because of that, it's really important to know, what you want to have some idea, right? Some of this you can ask questions of the family. Some of this you can try to do some amount of kind of background reading ahead, which is generally, just culturally speaking, what's considered appropriate and inappropriate, right? Instead of what you think is appropriate for you, right? So for example, when I worked as a clinician, there was a time in my clinical practice where I did a lot of early intervention. So I would go to kids' homes in different parts. This is in Philadelphia, in different parts of Philadelphia. And yeah, I mean, of course, some of the kids that I tested were Spanish English speakers. They were Hispanic, which is my background. So I'm very familiar with that background. It was natural for me, right? But I did test several kids who were not Spanish English dual language learners, but they spoke other languages, right? And sometimes you just want to be aware of that, right? So I remember I tested a kid whose parents spoke Arabic and English, and they were Muslim. And when I walked in, it was mom and dad, and I read ahead, and I was like, okay, I cannot necessarily assume that I'm going to like shake mom's hand because I'm a man and she's a woman, right? So I had to kind of respect that piece. And when I went in there, I said hi to the dad. I said hi to the mom, but I didn't necessarily make eye contact with her, shake her hand. And then when we were done with the whole evaluation, the dad asked me if I had lived somewhere else or where I was from, and so somewhere that we talked about it. And I was like, no, no, no. And I think he was wondering maybe whether my background was similar to theirs, which it wasn't. So I told him, no, no, I'm originally from Mexico City. And he was like, oh, well, I really appreciate you basically being respectful of kind of how we interact at home. And I said, yeah, of course, right? So these are the kinds of things you just, either you can kind of be prepared, or if you're not sure, you can always ask. It's totally okay to ask. And families usually really appreciate it when you ask, right? And not only is it about these interactions, but sometimes it's about vocabulary. Sometimes it's about, is this normal for your kid to do this, right? It's not uncommon, for example, from kids sometimes from backgrounds that might be different from like kind of this mainstream background, where a kid is instructed to not make eye contact with an adult, right? And when you test the kid and the kid's not making any eye contact with you, you might think that's really weird. But for a child, you just want to ask, hey, like, I noticed there wasn't any eye contact. Is that normal or not? And they will be like, well, yeah, you're an adult, so my kid knows not to like look at you, right? So these are kinds of things you just kind of want to be aware of, right? And the other piece here is, and the more experience you have working with culturally, linguistically diverse populations, the more prepared you are to do this. But a really important thing to just keep in mind is that when you're testing a child, especially I would say if it's an initial evaluation, especially if you're getting responses from the kid that seem to be way off, you just have to make sure. A lot of this has to do with the foil items. Sometimes you have to make adaptations, which is you want to make sure that it's lack of skill and that it's not that the kid has misunderstood, for example, the subtest, but the kid might not understand what the kid's supposed to do, right? You want to make sure you differentiate between those two things because that's critical in terms of, are you going to mark responses as correct or incorrect and why, right? Okay, so some assumptions with formal, when I say formal assessment, I'm going to talk about like formal using like standardized norm tools, right? At least in the United States, usually the assumption is that the kid knows English, and the reason because most of the assessment tools that we have available to us clinicians are normed on monolingual English-speaking kids. So I'll talk about tools that are not, but the vast majority are, right? So we kind of assume that this kid knows some English, right? That's not always the case, of course. We kind of are also assuming that the kid has been exposed to some of this content, right? Otherwise, how would you test the kid, right? So, if you're doing like the PLS, right, you're going to assume that the kid has seen, knows some vocabulary, seen some of these pictures, has played with like maybe like a little teddy bear toy, or like you're just making these assumptions, right? And then this last one I think is critical, which sometimes we assume that the kid knows basically how to interact in an assessment, right? And a lot of times when we assess kids, whether we're doing it in person or if we're doing it remotely this way, it's an interesting way to interact with someone, right? Because us as clinicians, we're essentially sort of interrogating the kid, right? We're telling the kid, okay, I want you to point to this. I want you to tell me what this is. I want you to fill in this blank, right? So we're basically telling the kid to perform for us on command, right? And when you really think about it, that's a very odd way to interact with someone. And unless if you've done it a lot, like maybe your parents do this with you all the time at home, right? They're teaching you colors, they're teaching you shapes, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes not all kids have that background where they've had a lot of experience with those types of interactions. And I think it's really important to just keep in mind, hey, like, this is what we're kind of assuming, right? Okay, so now assessing DLLs. Again, we want to make sure, hey, like, are we seeing a real limited lack of whether it's receptive or expressive language skills? And is it due to the fact that this kid has a language learning impairment, or it could also be speech sound production, or is it primarily maybe coming from maybe different degrees of language experience, right? Again, the majority of standardized norm reference tests have norms that are based on monolingual English-speaking kids. And yes, there are a few that have norms on bilingual kids, and I'll talk about what some of those are. And the few that do exist are overwhelmingly in Spanish and English. I kind of talked about this a little earlier on today in this talk, which is assessing one language is, you could think it's not enough, but I'm going to say it's sometimes not enough. And then we'll continue to talk about this, but think about the fact that, for example, in some school districts, the way that they'll handle dual language assessment is they will have the monolingual English SLP test the kid on a particular day in English. And then they'll schedule, quote unquote, the bilingual evaluation, which will be done by a bilingual SLP on a different day. But then that evaluation might not be bilingual. That evaluation might be like only in Spanish or only in Cantonese, right? And so then you've got an SLP who tests the kid in English, an SLP who tests the kid in another language, right? But imagine that the SLP who tests the kids in English basically looks at how the kid performed on this evaluation. And let's say that the kid is within normal limits, right? Do you then need to do more evaluation on the other language, right? You could, it would give you great information, but in terms of the purpose of a clinical assessment to either confirm or rule out language impairment, if you've been able to rule out language impairment in one language, you're clinically speaking, you're done, right? You don't need to then do the other language as well, right? The argument for doing both languages is when you test in one language and the kid might, it might seem that the kid performed really poorly, lots of challenges. The thing is, you only know half the answer then, right? You need to then confirm or rule out language impairment in the other language as well, right? Think about this bilingual continuum, right? When you have kids that are at these extremes of the continuum, when they have very strong skills and proficiency in one language, but very limited proficiency in the other language, when you have kids with that really unbalanced profile, those are especially the kids that we want to test bilingually. When you have kids that are more kind of not necessarily super balanced, but their profile is a little closer, because you can have kids who have comparable skills in both languages, but those skills might be really low, and then that's a kid with language impairment. Those kids might be average, or they might be like above average, right? So even a kid who seems to have balanced bilingual skills doesn't always mean that they're at a normal level. Sometimes they're severely depressed. They're just limited in both languages, right? Okay. Again, this is a general piece here, which I think is really important, right? Some of you who are here might have lots of experience. I know there's a question that came up, so I'll read it in a little bit. You might have tons of experience, so some of this might be like, this is old news to me, but some of you, maybe that you're just starting to assess kids who have who speak two languages or more. The first piece is and this is hard for some folks to do, but you really need to kind of just reconceptualize your thoughts on standardized norm reference testing. You just have to kind of think about it a little differently, because it is not uncommon to recommend that sometimes you have to make adaptations that might not be supported in the standardized assessment protocol, right? And then when you violate the standardized assessment protocol, then there's this whole issue, well, do I still report the standard scores, or do I report them with some caution because I made some adaptations, right? Second one is your basic principles about providing therapy, these fundamentals. Just revisit them because a lot of times you'll need them with dual language learners, right? Things like timing, behavior management. You need to think about some of these kind of real basic issues, like when you're doing testing. Yes, I mean, a kid might be getting some items wrong, but do you stop there, or then, okay, clearly this kid is responding to this item wrong, but can I do something during the assessment to do a little bit of deep testing, right? Is this kid stimulable for the skill, and with what degree of ease or difficulty is this kid stimulable or not, right? So these are these real basic therapeutic principles that you kind of want to think about again, right? Be ready to become comfortable with also doing informal testing, which sometimes some clinicians are very comfortable with, and some other clinicians don't really do much of it. They might do it like in therapy, but in actual assessment, they're like, no, I have to give the self, and that's what I'm giving this kid. So then there might not be much informal stuff happening. But with DLLs, you really want to be able to do some of this as well. The last one, no, sorry, 4, familiarize yourself with your client's native language. Doesn't mean you have to learn that language, but you want to know basics of that language in terms of its phonology, in terms of its morphosyntax, and what impact do you expect those kind of features of that language to impact the English production of a second language learner of English, of, let's say, of Spanish or of Vietnamese or of Cantonese, right? And there's a lot of literature. Some of it comes from our field, but a lot of it comes from TESOL discipline, the teaching English as a second or other language, where there's resources that they have. Some of these are online, some of these are books, where you can get an idea of what does the phonology tend to sound like of, let's say, a second language learner who's learning English but who speaks another language, right? What kinds of phonological patterns am I likely to see, so that you're aware of like what things are probably going to be errors and what things are what you're seeing that seem errors might be influenced by the client's native language. That's what I mean by familiarize yourself. I don't mean you have to learn every language that everyone speaks. And the last one, just be aware of how to put together a least biased assessment protocol. Okay, before I go on, there's a question. I have a classroom kindergarten teacher who asked for support and asking a parent about what they observe of their child at home. The teacher has observed that the student has shown very little progress in independent work skills and following directions. With conferences coming up, teachers planning to get more information on home life, child experience routines. What is an inclusive and respectful way of getting this information? Let's see if I'm kind of processing this question correctly. So, classroom teacher who asked for support about this, so maybe we can. Is the question of how to get this information, like how the teacher can get that information from their parents? Is that what the question is about? Make sure I. Yes. Sure. I think the teacher, I mean, maybe you can assist with this if the teacher's coming to you, which is set up. It could be like a conference call. It could be like a meeting at the school. You have to remember sometimes parents can't come to a parent-teacher meeting at 11 a.m. because they're working, right? So sometimes you have to work around parent schedules, but try to set up a meeting, whether it's in person, remotely, over the phone, and talk about what are, so as a teacher, you can say, well, I'm seeing difficulties with following directions. And you probably then want to give the parents examples of what directions might, so that, hey, like when you're at home with your kid and you tell your kid, hey, I want you to like put on your jacket before you put on your shoes, can the child do that, right? That's like a conditional 2-step direction, right? If the parents are like, oh yeah, that's not a problem, that we're not concerned with our kids sort of like understanding what we tell him or her, but we are concerned with X, Y, and Z, then there might be some convergence there. But if the parents are like, we're not concerned at all about their language and our kid is, you know, well, what's happening in school and the parent, you know, and this could be a second language issue or it could not be. But yeah, I would say, you know, a respectful and inclusive way is to actually just talk to the parents, right? And get an idea of whether the teacher's concerns converge with the parents' concerns or are they totally different, right? Someone attached the, well, I'm not going to click on that now, but someone attached something which I'm assuming provides some information to that end. Washington State Early Learning Guidelines, birth to third grade. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about tests. I'm going to talk about this really quickly. Hopefully, this will be old news to all of you, I hope, which is, you know, again, it really depends on where you work, right? When I started working as a clinician and in this district that got sued by the Office of Civil Rights, sure enough, some of the tests that they had available to us as clinicians in the public school were like completely outdated, right? And the school district just happened to, I don't want to say that they didn't care, they just didn't know because there weren't any bilingual speech pathologists, right? So they had these very outdated tests, and some of them were translations from their English versions. They were translated to Spanish. And the question is, if you're gonna, well, I would say most of the tests that I can think of that are in the market now are not translations anymore. So this is not really a concern unless if you're working in a particular setting where they just have, let's say, the PLS 2 or the PLS 3 in Spanish, which were mainly translations, right? Are they valid? Well, if they were originally developed in English and they were standardized on monolingual English speakers, and the psychometric properties of that test were established on an English norm, right? Norming sample. By that, I mean, there's different psychometric properties. The most important ones that we tend to think in clinical practice are sensitivity and specificity, right? So sensitivity is like, you know, what are the proportion or the likelihood that a test is correctly identifying a kid that has a language disorder, right? And then specificity, which is kind of the inverse of that, which is like, what is the likelihood or proportion of time which a kid who does not have a language disorder will demonstrate that they do not have a language disorder, right? So you want a test that has a high specificity and high specificity in both languages. But for a lot of translated tests, those properties were established for English, right? So the answer is no, right? If you have access to a translated test that someone in your workplace says, well, this is what we have, I'm willing to bet that it's probably a very outdated test. And you would then, you know, just go online and look up this test and figure out what's the most current version, and then see if your employer can acquire that version, and don't use a version that's like quite outdated, right? So again, this is really something that all the tests that I know about are no longer translated, but there could still be some out there that someone might say, hey, here's your tools, right? Okay, so here are some of the tests that are available now on the market, and I'm calling these formal adaptations because these are tests that were originally developed for monolingual English speakers. They were originally normed on monolingual English speakers. The whole structure of the test was developed for monolingual English speakers. And some of these publishers have worked with scholars in the field to develop these adaptations, right? They're not translations, they're adapted to another language. That means most of these tests have done a pretty good job of, one, norming it on bilingual speakers in the United States, but also in terms of the item development, ideally, not necessarily scrapping everything from the English one, but really thinking about, you know, when we order these items in each one of these languages, are they going to be the same? Are they going to be different? And, you know, they probably need to be different because the languages are different, right? So I'll kind of go through each of these briefly. So the MacArthur-Bates Communication Development Inventories, we just tend to call it the CDI. This is definitely obviously for very young kids, and it's essentially a parental questionnaire of words that the kids know and say. And there's different forms. There's like words only, there's sentences. It's available in Spanish. It's available in multiple other languages as well. If you go to the CDI website, you'll get an idea of all the languages that it's available in. And this test has been around for quite a long time. And again, it's based for like very, very young kids. Then you've got the preschool language scales 5, the PLS 5. The PLS for monolingual English speakers is very popular. The PLS 5, quote unquote, in Spanish is wildly popular. I would say that at least in school-based practice, the PLS and then the next one, the SELF, tend to be, I believe, some of the most widely used tests for school-age kids. PLS is obviously for a younger age range. SELF is for more like elementary, middle school kids. And these are the two latest versions that have been normed on Spanish-speaking kids. The SELF 5 in Spanish should be coming out soon. I don't know when, but I know it's been in development for a while. A lot of times these new editions of tests take about 10 years to come out. So I think the SELF 5, I know that it's in development. I don't know where they're at in terms of completing it. But both of these, well, especially the SELF, those of you who are familiar with the SELF takes a really long time to administer. Just keep that in mind, because for the SELF in Spanish, it doesn't really have any items in English. So then you have to do the SELF in English too, which is, if you think about an assessment session and how long you have to work with a kid, doing both of these is like torture for a kid. So you probably won't be able to do it one session. The PLS allows some degree of bilingual administration, which is an improvement, I would say, over the SELF 4. This other one here is something that I don't think is very widely used. It's something that I'm familiar with. It's a criterion reference test. It's not reference. It's called the SLAP, the Spanish Language Assessment Procedures. I think it's a really nice tool. It gives you a lot of information on what the kids can and can't do. It's just not, it doesn't have a norming sample, right? And then these last two are used quite a bit. And they're nice in the sense that they have a very wide age range all the way through adulthood. And it's the ROWPVT and the EOWPVT. It's a mouthful. And they're called like the Spanish or the bilingual edition. And these are normed on Spanish English speakers in the US. These are great for vocabulary. They're not great for anything other than vocabulary, right? So if for some reason you just really want to know about vocabulary, these two are great. But if you want to know about speech sound production, if you want to know about morphosyntax, these tests are not going to give you that much. They're not going to give you that information, right? This is just about semantic word knowledge, right? In terms of phonology and artic, this one, the contextual probe of articulation competence in Spanish, the CPAC-S, it's been out for over 10 years, but it's nice because it contains both a screening and then actually a full evaluation. And it is normed on US Spanish English speakers, and it accounts for multiple dialectical variations of Spanish. So it's a really nice tool for that. This test here, the Spanish articulation measures, it's definitely very focused on artic. It's kind of the sister test to the SLAP. It's also really nice, but again, it is criterion reference, not norm referenced. And then this is the newest one that's just focused on artic, which is the Gluman-Frista test of articulation, version 3 in Spanish. It has both this one and this one, they have very good psychometric properties. This test, I think you guys, so Olivia's asking about these resources. I think you all have access to these slides. So you will have the slides for this. This literally just came out, I guess, not today, but literally like a month ago. It's in development for a while. It's called the Quick Interactive Language Screener, English Spanish. This is a screening tool. It's not an assessment, but screenings are like extremely important, of course, in the assessment process, because a lot of times, I shouldn't say a lot of times, but sometimes the referrals that we get as speech language pathologists to do a full evaluation on dual language learners, sometimes they're very well targeted and sometimes they're not, right? Sometimes we get referrals for kids where teachers are concerned because they don't know enough English. And then we go ahead and test these kids, they're totally fine. But then we have spent time and resources where if we had a good screener, we could have said, this kid's not at risk for language impairment. This is a second language acquisition issue. So this is not a good referral. This is not a kid we should be spending 2 to 3 hours in testing, right? So anyway, this is a screening tool. It is normed on US Spanish English speakers. It is technically, you would say, an adaptation because there's a quiz for monolingual English speakers. But this is really nice because all of the items are, especially on the Spanish piece of it, are developed specifically for Spanish. It covers this age range that you see here, 3 to 5'11". It's a really nice little screening tool because it's automated. It's intended to be administered, for example, on a touch screen device, usually a tablet, but it can also be administered remotely also. And a kid can like click on a mouse or a trackpad, but it's automated. So the folks who can administer this screener don't necessarily have to be, let's say like a Spanish speaker, right? How long does it take to administer? It's a good question. Each language takes about 15 to 20 minutes, depending on the kid. So the whole thing might take like somewhere between 30 to 40 minutes. It's nice because it screens these domains. It screens semantics, morphosyntax, and it also does this domain, which we usually don't think about, which the quiz calls process. But what that means is it's really fast mapping. So it's the ability for a kid to learn new words, right? So these novel words, and the ability for a kid to kind of learn things like passive constructions, for example, like different morphosyntactic constructions. And it tests that both in Spanish and in English. And then the score that you get from the Quills ES is quote unquote your best language score, right? So it doesn't necessarily give you a score for English or a score for Spanish, but in the semantics, the kid's probably going to have a difference in their English and Spanish score. It's going to give you the best language score for semantics, the best language score for morphosyntax, and the best language score for process. And then overall, it's going to tell you, yes, the kid passed the screener or the kid did not pass the screener, right? Kid does not pass the screener, that's a kid who you would want to refer for speech and language evaluation. If a kid passes the screener, that's a kid who you can feel pretty comfortable in not doing a full evaluation. But if there's a lot of concern from a lot of people, this is a kid you might potentially want to screen, let's say like a semester later or a year later, make sure that they're still passing, right? My EL teachers and school guidance team work together to administer this before. Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a great idea from Eileen, which is, can other people give this? We're not SOPs. Yes, definitely. That's one of the things that makes this tool really nice, that you don't have to be a clinician to administer this tool. Okay, and then there's this is like a full assessment. It's called the Bilingual English-Spanish Assessment, or the VESA. It's been around for longer than people think. Like I said, I work at UT Dallas. I have collaborated with clinicians in the Dallas Independent School District who to this day have never heard of this test, right? And I think that's starting to change because initially this test was marketed by a very small company. And now it has been, now it's going to be marketed by Brooks, which is a much larger company. Someone asked, the quills normed for children. Yes, the quills is normed on kids up to 5'11", yes. So now it's being marketed by Brooks. So I think it's gaining more traction. But the really important thing is, yes, it's standardized, it's nationally normed. Here's the age range. This is the first test, at least in the United States, that was developed entirely for Spanish, English, dual language learners. It was in development for a long time. There were multiple grants to fund this test. It's a really excellent test. It's nationally normed. It accounts for 17 dialects of Spanish. It includes these kind of questionnaire surveys, one intended for parents, one intended for teachers, that give you tons of background information. When informally assessing a language, one doesn't understand. So you just say that translation of the test, but nothing. I have the same doubt. When you're informally assessing a language you don't understand, would you say a translation of a test is better than nothing? Yes, better than nothing, yes. Not awesome, but you just want to have, an idea of what you're going to be assessing. And you just want to be very judicious in the sense that you realize that this is not a way that you would necessarily say, yes, this is definitely language impairment. You will need to kind of do other informal tasks other than providing a translation of a test. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so just to wrap up on the VESA, it's nice because you can basically assess basically everything, right? It does semantics, morphosyntax, and it also does speech sound production in both languages. Okay, so now, like the VESA is great. Do you only do the VESA, right? For example, and the answer is no, right? We know that the best evidence that we have for assessing kids and having the most reliable outcomes is to use converging evidence, right? What does that mean? That means that you're using more than one source of assessment evidence to make a diagnostic decision, right? Really important part is these language experience questionnaires. You can think about this as part of like your case history, but it could be, for example, these questionnaires from the VESA. There's other questionnaires that you can use as well to look at, for example, let's say, what does home language use look like in the home, both input and output between not just the parents, but maybe like siblings and friends, and so forth. Then you can get that information also from the teacher, right? What's happening in the classroom. But having these questionnaires is very valuable. Doing bilingual language sample analysis, ideally where you're comparing the child's performance to very large databases of other bilingual kids is very helpful. Evaluating learning potential, think of things like dynamic assessment, response to intervention, get an idea of, yeah, maybe a kid can't do task A, but if you teach kid to do task A, is it really easy for the kid to learn that task, or is it really hard for the kid to learn that task, right? Is it really easy for you to teach, or is it really hard for you to teach? That's the learning potential piece. And then the standardized testing, you want to make sure you're using tests ideally that are normed on dual language learners, and I'm aware that that's not always possible for all dual language learners, but whenever possible, you do want to do that. So yes, you can administer both formal and informal measures. You can assess these language skills. I've already talked about this. That means sometimes you'll assess both language skills, and sometimes you don't, right? You always want to be aware, is there a mismatch between the languages that I speak and the language that this kid speaks? Is there a mismatch in terms of the dialect that I speak and the dialect this kid speaks, right? So you always want to be aware of some of these mismatches, right? When conducting, for example, like a language use questionnaire, case history, I just think it's so important. Whenever possible, do it in person, do it over the phone, do it remotely via Zoom, however the case, but you want to be able to answer any questions the parents have. You want to clarify items that maybe the parents don't fully understand what it's asking for. So in other words, sometimes we'll say, well, we'll send a case history form home with the parents, and we're just going to assume that they'll fill it out and that they know what they're answering. Trust me, with dual language learning families, this is just so valuable to do it in the phone over, like either do it dynamically with the families. Don't just give them a piece of paper and hope that they'll be able to give you the answers that you want, right? Again, this last piece is adapting things, right? Which is you want to provide cues in the non-target language, right? If necessary, right? So you want to get an idea of like how stimulable the kid is, right? And if those cues are effective, or if they're not effective, you still want to track the effectiveness of that cue. And that's going to give you a lot more information about what the kid can do and what the kid can't do, and what the kid can do with some degree of stimulability, right? Okay, so in that converging evidence framework, I'm going to now focus on bilingual language sample analysis. So I've done a lot of work in this area. When I worked as a clinician, I used language sample analysis with almost every single child I assessed. It's a developmentally sensitive task. It's nice because this is one task where you can get information on multiple domains of language at the same time. And we know that it's a gold standard for expressive language assessment for both monolingual kids or bilingual kids. Some people are bringing up some things. Can I share an example? I don't have an example in my slides, but I can talk about some questionnaires that are available. Maybe I'll put some of those together when I send Lisa like a list of references. But there are two that are part of the VESA that I think you can actually just buy the questionnaires too from Brooks if you don't want to buy the whole assessment, which you probably should buy the whole assessment. But so there's one called iTalk and then one's called a BIOS, and they're not the only ones, but those are good ones, but there's other ones too. And I believe our next speakers are going to talk about another set of language questionnaires. They're really good too. Okay, so LSA, language sample analysis, these are just an example of multiple air domains that you can identify and examine based on one task, right? And you can get all this information, which is really cool. Basic recommendations for those of you who maybe don't feel super comfortable or haven't done it in a long time, just be enthusiastic and friendly. That's pretty basic, right? A really important part though is if you're asking a kid, let's say, to give you a language sample, you have to record the kid. You probably don't want to be writing down everything the kid says. One, because the kid's going to think that's really weird and then you're not listening to them. And two, because you're probably not going to be super accurate in terms of trying to write it in real time. Keep things really simple. Be patient with the kid. If possible, and I'm going to tell you that this is possible, at least for Spanish English speakers, you want to use the protocol that was used in the database, right? So does it use a specific script? Does it use specific materials? Can you give the kid verbal assistance or not? You want to, some of these databases that I'm going to show you have really specific protocols that you want to follow. Okay, so basic steps, you want to get the language sample. Want to transcribe it. Most people say, look, can I do this automatically? I think eventually it will, but we're not quite there yet. This is getting better and better, but a lot of this automated transcription stuff is really based on corpora of adult language samples. So with kids, it gets a little tougher. With kids with language impairments and with kids with speech sound production issues, it gets extremely inaccurate. So you want to be able to do it yourself. You then want to analyze and interpret your results. So one question might be, well, what kind of narrative do you collect, right? So let's please, well, I'm just going to ask the kid like what they did last weekend or what they did on vacation, and that's okay. But there's some amount of disadvantages. So I'm going to show you a narrative that I obtained from a kid in Head Start in Philadelphia, right? This is a narrative the kid provided in Spanish, but I'm going to show it to you in English so that everyone understands it. And this happened when I was a master's student, and I got really freaked out because I thought I needed to call someone, right? So let me show you what the kid said. So my dad came home late one night. He lied on my bed, and during the night, he started to scratch me, and I saw the pee-pee on the bed and stayed asleep. My mom got mad, and she threw him out the window, right? And I was like, what happened, right? I immediately talked to the parents, and I was like, do I need to know something? Like, what's going on? And then eventually, the mom started laughing, and she said, oh, this is about a cat, like a stray cat that my husband brought home. And I got really angry, and I threw the cat out. So this whole thing is about a cat, right? That the dad brought in from the street. Not great for the cat, but it's not what you might think it is. But this is an example of, there's some good things about this, but a lot of times you have no idea what the kid's talking about. You don't know who the kid's referring to. And sometimes the kids won't talk very much. You just ask them to tell you about what they did, yesterday. So if you do narrative language samples, you have lots of advantages. One is with a narrative language sample, you have some degree of control over what the kid's talking about, probably how long the kid's going to talk, and the content that the kid's providing for, right? It tends to be easier because you're giving the kids something to talk about versus you having the kids sort of think about something to talk about. We know from prior work that narrative language skills are highly academically relevant and they predict bilingual reading achievement. It's recognized to be at least biased. Okay, looks like I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to hurry through this, and you can do this frequently. It also meets Common Core standards that we tend to have in different states around the country, especially for narrative comprehension and production. So in terms of the task, it's nice. You can include lots of different tools. One of the ones that I'm going to advocate is to use storybooks and ideally have wordless picture storybooks, right? Doing that gives kids visual supports. It doesn't make them sort of remember a bunch of things. And you can look at these books ahead of time, make sure that they're culturally appropriate. So what are the steps? These are basic steps, right? You collect the samples, probably in both languages. You can evaluate them multiple different ways. One way is to use this software called systematic analysis for language transcripts. And you want to look for how the kids compare to these databases, but also maybe how their language skills change over time. If it's like a kid who's already in therapy, for example. And you're going to compare them to other bilingual kids rather than comparing them to monolingual kids. So here's some sampling of some of the databases that are available. The one that I want you all to focus on are these. These are the bilingual Spanish and the bilingual English story retail databases built into this program. These are the different frog stories that are included, the different age ranges, and then these are the kids that are included in these databases. So you're going to be comparing kids to thousands of other DLLs, right, doing the same task in English and Spanish. A real basic sort of illustration. You provide a model for the kid. You tell the kid a story. Let's say one of these stories. If you're doing a retell, then you're asking the kid to tell you back that same story. Another way to do it is to have the kid tell you a different story. Which one's better? I feel for assessment, retell's better. If you're trying to teach kids narrative skills in therapy, unique's probably better. So again, I already talked about some of this stuff, right? The thing is, it has lots of advantages. You know what the kid's talking about. If you're going to follow the protocol, there's a script, and then you can't give the kid information. Sometimes kids will ask, well, what's this? And you just kind of like raise your shoulder, you don't know. There's a few things you can do. You can repeat what the kid said to try to keep the kid talking. And there's some free courses you can access to kind of get an idea of how to elicit these samples. So, you know, I talked about some of the things that you can look at, but if you use these databases, you can really compare the performance of, let's say, a particular Spanish English DLL to that of thousands of other DLLs in all of these areas, right? And you can age match the kids, grade match the kids. Really quickly, I'm going to show you two kids who were sampled, two different DLLs, a kid in first grade, a kid in third grade, and how they compare, right? So here is the two kids. These are their measures. You have mean length of utterance in words, number of different words per minute. These are all in English, and then the same measures in Spanish. And these are their measures from the language sample. And, you know, sometimes people say, well, I want to compare this to this, English to Spanish and English to Spanish. And that's not necessarily, I'm sorry, like 6.57 and 5.1, that's not super helpful, right? It's like, well, what is it? What does that mean, right? If you use these databases, you can then actually get a comparison to other kids, to thousands of other kids, to get an idea of how closely are they, right, in terms of like a standard deviation. And so we have this kid, right? This is compared her English, these measures here compared to other English, the English of other bilingual kids. Seems pretty good on everything. She's even high. She's above average in her speaking rate, but her Spanish is pretty low across everything, right? But this is a kid who you would say, okay, this is a probably English dominant kid, right? Who's age appropriate in terms of narrative production. But Alex is low on everything in both languages. This is a kid you would definitely be concerned about in terms of their narrative skills, right? But without having a reference database, you can't do this, right? And so it's ideal to have this. So take-home messages. This is considered informal assessment, but if you use this tool, it's highly data-driven, highly specific. How long do these samples take? Based on thousands of these samples that we collected with kids, the kids usually provide these samples in about 5 minutes or less in each language. Of course, the transcription takes some time. The more practice you get with it, the faster you get, but the samples are short and the analyses are nearly automatic. Okay, to wrap up, some basic issues in terms of intervention. One is, what languages do you provide intervention in? Another one is, what if you don't speak your native language? I won't click on this because we don't have time, but ASHA has provided this practice portal for multiple issues. One of them has to do with bilingual service delivery and addresses a lot of these issues, right? Now we'll talk about them a little bit right before we end. These are issues that I think we need to be take into consideration when we provide intervention. Obviously, cultural awareness, but a lot of times you'll have to adapt and modify existing materials if they're not available in the language that the kids speak. And then collaboration and advocacy is really important. And then obviously, what languages do you intervene in, or what language? So with therapy, in order to get the most kind of bang for your buck, you want buy-in from the families, right? Not just from the kid, but also the kid's family. So sometimes a family's perspective on what is a disability or what is an illness might be really different from yours. And so you need to be aware of these differences so that you can sort of come to some common ground. So when asked, collect retells in both languages, I would say when possible, yes, unless if different people are assessing the kid in different languages. Person A conducts a retell in one language, analyzes it, and sees how the kid's doing, right? If the kid's look is really good in that one language, you might not need to do a retell in the other language. I'm answering a question from the chat. So anyways, you want to be familiar, you want to be accepting of different cultural, pragmatic styles. Part of that, we have to be comfortable in doing that, and we have to kind of try to unlearn our own biases for what we think is appropriate and correct, right? And there's also guidance from ASHA in terms of cultural competence in this regard. Therapy materials often need to be adapted. Not everything, but a lot of materials are in English. Sometimes you just need to adapt them. Could be as simple as, hey, maybe I don't know, you're going to do like chutes and ladders for something, but I'll just use colored tape, right? Do you have to cover the words up in English? Not necessarily, but you can put the words in the other language next to the words in English, right? So you can have both languages if they look on a particular game board, or board games that don't have any words on them. Therapy approaches, you can also modify them so that they're congruent both culturally and linguistically. Not going to talk, this is just a game called Snail's Pace Race. I'm not going to spend time on it because I'm basically almost out of time, but essentially this is one of my favorite things I used in therapy. It's just, that's all it is. It has snails of different colors, dice of different color. You start them here, this is where they end. And you can do multiple things in therapy with this, right? Colors, order, you can have kids make predictions, so on and so forth. I'm going to answer that question from Eileen a little bit. Therapy goals for individual, yes. So we have to write goals for therapy, right? A lot of the things that we tend to write goals for tend to be similar, right? So rather than kind of reinventing the wheel, there are some resources that are available. And there's probably others. This is one that I'm familiar with. This is a company that does a lot of work in this area, bilinguistics. You can access these for free on their website, and there's goals for artic, for expressive language, for vocabulary, and they're written in English and in Spanish. They might be in other languages too, I don't recall. But these are the areas it covers. So it's nice because it can start as a template for you, and then you can make these more specific. But again, it's a really nice template to begin with rather than you having to create it from scratch. Collaboration and advocacy, you need to collaborate with not just other SLPs, but educational psychologists, teachers, principals, definitely parents if you're working obviously in early intervention. And you want to be able to consult with other bilingual professionals, right? And that could mean other bilingual SLPs, or it could also mean bilingual professionals in other areas that are maybe co-treating the kid, right? And you being the communication professional, you can be the person, you don't have to do this, but you can do this, and I would encourage you to do this. You can be a really strong advocate for bilingual kids and families in your caseload, right? And make sure that parents know what their rights are. Okay, finally, languages of intervention. Theory needs to be consistent with not just, you want to use languages of intervention that are going to make sense for the kid, with what the kid can do. You can think about parents' preference to some degree, but the big one is functionality, right? So we know the literature tells us if you support intervention in their home language, it tends to be extremely helpful for the kid, especially if that home language is still functional for the kid. Sometimes people will say, well, the kid is in an English-only school, so it's not functional for the kid anymore, but the kid still has to go home and talk to their parents, right? So if the parents don't speak English at home, then the other language continues to be functional for that kid, right? A really important thing for SLPs, we are not ESL teachers, we're not TESOL teachers, unless if we have training in that area. So it's not the goal of therapy. The goal of therapy is not to teach kids English, right? The goal of kid is to work with kids who have language impairments. Okay, lots of questions coming up. So some of these we might have to address in the Q&A because I think I'm out of time. Okay, supporting home language, really important. We know that skills can transfer. We know that it can help to slow down or sometimes prevent the attrition of the other language. And we know that skills can transfer. Does that mean that therapy, you do it only in one language? You only do it in the home language, you don't do it in English? And the answer to that question is, it kind of depends on where the kid's at, right? So thinking of the kid is stronger in language A, weaker in language B, so I'm only going to use language A. That's not necessarily the best framework because language dominance is not constant, right? A kid's language dominance and proficiency will probably change over time, and you need to be responsive to that time, right? And again, keep in mind, right? Maybe the kid's vocabulary is really good in both languages, but maybe their phonology isn't, right? So keep that in mind as well. And we know that over time, these skills are co-affecting each other, right? And we know there's distribution, there's sort of co-activation, there's all these issues coming up. Okay, so what's the end goal? You want to promote growth, right? One approach generally is to use a bilingual approach. And what that means is, in this therapy approach, you can provide therapy essentially in either language, right? You can provide it in English, you can provide it in another language. And the idea here is that the language itself that you're providing the therapy in is not really important because you're working on shared cognitive skills, right? So some of these might have to do with overall semantic organization, things like convergent naming, right? Like the skill of sort of saying like pizza and tacos and donuts and hamburgers are all what, right? So this kind of semantic organization stuff, those are kind of shared cognitive linguistic skills, right? And then the cross-linguistic approach is where your part of your therapy might be only in English, or part of your therapy might be only in another language, let's say Spanish, because what you're targeting is you're targeting aspects that are unique to each language, right? So let's say in English, if you're targeting regular past tense ed, right? That's specific to English. You can't target past tense ed in a language that's not English because that other language is going to mark past tense differently, right? And that might not be a problem for the kid, right? You might be targeting something like maybe like gender agreement, which does not exist in English. Then you would only treat that, let's say, in a language like Spanish. You couldn't treat that in English because it doesn't exist in English. Those parts will require a cross-linguistic approach. And they're not mutually exclusive. You kind of combine both, right? Depending on what it is that you're working on. These last two are just kind of basic things that you can use, not just with DLLs, but across the board with monolingual too, right? This is really kind of more relevant to early intervention, where you're essentially training the parents to be really the interventionists, right? This is nice for classrooms, kind of doing some peer-mediated intervention where you're pairing typically developing kids with language impaired kids. You collaborate with the teacher, you provide some of these scripted play activities or instructional activities in the classroom. You're monitoring what the kids are doing, and you can go in and do some mediation whenever necessary, right? But kids love being paired up, and kids tend to love helping each other, right? And having a typically developing kid paired with an impaired kid is nice because the kid's providing a great language model for the kids who's language impaired. Finally, bilingual service providers. ASHA has a technical definition that has been around since the late 80s. And the idea is you can speak or sign 2 or more languages. So you have the language skills and the literacy skills to do that. But that you also have received, or if you didn't receive it when you were a graduate student, that you later developed it, specialized training to serve these populations, right? So you need to have both of those pieces, not just the language piece. Again, I've talked about this before, but there's very few bilingual service providers, and ASHA knows this is important. They're making all kinds of efforts to really recruit more bilingual SLPs into our field, which I think is a really good goal. Monolingual SLPs, what if I don't speak the client's native language? That can happen to a bilingual SLP too, right? Me as a bilingual SLP, if I have to test or do intervention with a kid who doesn't speak Spanish, who speaks another language, that basically puts me in that camp of being a monolingual SLP too, right? So can you assess and treat in English? Yes, when appropriate. But it's really important to kind of gather information on these languages as much as possible. And there is a lot of information out there. You want to be very careful about what tests you're using and how you're using them. And you want to be able to kind of take information like you learned today, for example, and you want to be able to train and inform personnel that you work with. And it's really important. Even if you're serious bilingual SLP, there's no reason why you can't network with bilingual SLPs, right? I think most bilingual SLPs would be really happy to provide information and provide guidance. And this is the last slide, which is working with interpreters. I have qualified interpreter and with a little asterisk because the definition of that is very tough to achieve. Most of the time we work with paraprofessionals in the schools. But having interpreters is really important for intervention and assessment, but especially in intervention, you're doing co-treatment essentially, right? The interpreters are with you. And this is a framework that's highly recommended, which is whenever possible, before the actual therapy session, and you can do this at the beginning of the week or what have you, you want to be able to meet with your interpreter and talk about, these are the kinds of things I'm going to work on today. These are the goals I'm targeting, right? So that not everything's totally new for the interpreter. Then during the interaction, you want it to be, as seamless as possible. You want to be able to chunk information. You don't want to like talk for like 5 minutes and then have the interpreter talk for 5 minutes. That's too much. And the idea here is that the child is really kind of interacting with the interpreter, but you're telling the interpreter what to say, right? You also don't want the interpreter to just take over and then you're not doing anything. And then finally, debriefing is really important, which is you then communicating with the interpreter after that has been over, right? After the session has been over, you want to debrief them. You don't want to interrupt them in the middle of the session, but you want to talk about it later. And you want the interpreter to also tell you as the SLP whether they thought you were going too fast, whether they thought some stuff was stuff that you guys hadn't talked about before, whether they would benefit from a different type of interaction style. You want to be able to have this really kind of bi-directional communication with your interpreter. And ASHA also has recommendations for this. There's a book here that Language and Science have, and then it looks like there's another book that came out. Okay, so I'm done. I know I'm a little over time. There's a lot of questions that I think we will try to get to during the Q&A. So I'm going to...
Thank you so much, Dr. Rojas.